Hello, so today we're going to talk about effective instruction and what that looks like in a history social science classroom. Okay, so first section is called Instruction That Works. One thing is to vary your instructional methods and strategies. So you definitely want to stay away from long lectures and teach through various activities. So typically in history and social science in my classroom, I would start off every unit or a segment with a very short lecture, maybe 10-15 minutes just to cover the background knowledge. And even within that, you want to incorporate things like check for understanding and discussion questions to keep the kids engaged. And then we'll delve deeper into that topic and the historical event through analyzing like primary, secondary sources, watching videos, maybe a project or an online module. You also want to teach your students how to think, learn, and remember, and you can do so through inquiry questions, making connections, and using prior knowledge. You want to assess understanding and use the results to improve your teaching. So you can do so by using formative assessments and check for understanding throughout your lesson. So a check for understanding can be just as simple as asking one question in between a lecture slide, just to make sure that kids are staying on task and understanding the material that you're covering. A more in-depth formative assessment could be students writing a paragraph on something that they learned today, and then you can kind of assess that and see if there's anything that you need to go back and cover the next day. You also want to use the right tools and technology to enhance your instruction, and you want to make sure that your technology that you're using is helpful and not distracting. Especially in a history social science classroom, technology can be super useful. For example, Google My Maps is a great technology to use, especially for incorporating geography into your lessons, because you can have students create their own maps with themes, and you can have them put notes and pictures and make connections to the topic that you're covering for that day or for that unit. All right, classroom culture. One thing is you want to make sure you're supporting all students to ensure success, and you can do so through differentiation and scaffolding. One way that I like to scaffold for my classroom is to take maybe a newspaper article or some kind of a reading, and then I will have an easier version of that reading for my students with special needs and or English learners, or maybe even struggling students whose reading level may not be as advanced as some of my other students. It's a really subtle way for me to differentiate without bringing it to the attention of other kids, but everyone is still getting the same information and they're still able to complete the same activity for the most part. You also want to make sure you're maintaining a safe and productive learning environment by establishing and maintaining high expectations for not only work quality but behavior as well. And you want to make sure you're cultivating a safe and respectful environment. When I'm student teaching, one thing that I have to make sure that I do all the time is once I set an expectation for a behavior, like if I tell my students that they have to raise their hand to answer a question, I have to make sure that I'm only calling and acknowledging the students who are raising their hands. And if someone calls out an answer without raising their hand, I have to address that and say, hey, you have to raise your hand to answer a question. And then finally, you want to make sure that you are teaching skill and knowledge in context. So that means not only are you teaching content in your subject area, but you want to teach skill through your content. So a skill would be like writing a main claim, and you can teach that skill of writing a main claim through content of whatever you're covering through that unit. And then finally, curriculum basics. One thing is to organize your instruction around big ideas and essential questions. So an example that I brought up in class the other day is if I was covering a unit on the 1920s, the big idea or the big essential question for that entire unit would be why was the 1920s filled with social and economic and political extremes? And then I can go into smaller lesson units like covering the Prohibition or the Harlem Renaissance, and then I can start to make connections in between those lessons, which seemingly would not be related if you were just to learn one after another. But when you have that big idea that connects it all, you can start to tie in different lessons and make connections. So that goes to my next bullet point, which is help students make connections. You can definitely help make connections between historical events, like I just mentioned, but you can also make connections between the past and the present. So, for example, when we covered the prohibition in my classroom, we compared it to current marijuana regulations. And so that's another good way to help kids see how history and past events can relate to the present and what's going on in modern times. And finally, we want to design lessons and units for maximum learning and engagement. So we can do so through daily learning targets with a measurable outcome. And we want to make sure that we're teaching for understanding and not for tests.